This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. So many of us have stories about times in our life where we've just felt like we're going through a dark patch filled with insecurity and uncertainty and anxiety and even depression. But equally, many of us have stories about how in those darkest times we turned to a creative outlet like photography and how it gave us back exactly what we needed in that moment to get through to brighter days. And that's exactly what this little film is about. I first met Paul way back in the summer of 2018, and we sat in a West End coffee shop in London for a good couple of hours as he taught me through the work that he'd been making for more than 40 years, most of it portrait photography. As we sat talking over cinnamon buns, he told me about the huge amount of negatives that he'd actually collected over the years with images of the people in his life and the travels that he'd taken around the world. And those negatives were becoming so many, so numerous, and so heavy that they were actually starting to warp the floorboards of his upstairs office, threatening to come crashing through into his kitchen below. So he actually had to start reinforcing those floorboards to make sure his house didn't fall apart for the sheer weight of the photographs that he'd made. As he taught me through all this photography that he had made, I was thinking to myself the whole time, this is really great work. But it wasn't until he arrived at a particular set of portraits he'd made during the early 80s as an unsure 20-something trying to navigate a difficult period in his life that things really struck a chord with me. Not just for the fact that they were beautiful portraits in themselves with their beautiful contrasty and slightly grainy black and white look to them, but more so the story that went alongside them and how photography had rescued Paul at a particular period in his life. I encouraged him way back then to put these images in a book and to tell this story and put it out into the world. And in the intervening years, it's true that Paul's put out a number of books already of different work that he's done, but it's taken him this long to compile this particular body of work, probably because it's so personal to him. But I, for one, am very glad that this book is now going to come into the world where it can inspire others and hopefully bring them some comfort. And because the release of this book is just around the corner, I thought it would be a great time to sit down with Paul and capture an interview with him so he can tell us the story behind this body of work that he's made. And I know you're going to find it incredibly inspiring, not just because Paul is a fantastic storyteller, but more because I know so many of us go through times where the blues descend or the dark passenger takes over on our journey, and we need to turn to some sort of creativity like photography to lead us towards brighter days. I have no doubt that you're going to be inspired by these nostalgic portraits that he's made back in the 80s, a time that's now starting to regain its romance. But more than that, I hope you find some comfort in his words and in his stories, especially if you're feeling a little lost on your own journey, and that he gives you some ideas about how to move forward. So I'm going to shut up now and let you hear from my friend, Paul Hutson.
People have always been important to me, right from the beginning. I've asked myself quite a few times, why do I focus so much on people, if you'll pardon the pun? And I think it's partly because I write, I feel a lot, I'm quite an emotional, sensitive person. And I'm open to all the issues of the human condition, and I'm looking for affirmation that other people feel the same, that other people have similar worries and concerns and anxieties that I have. And in having that conversation, an authentic conversation when I make a photograph, I can plug into other people's experiences and really reference my own position in life through them. What was interesting was when I first started doing portrait photography, I bought an old Rolleiflex twin lens reflex camera back in 1983 and experimented taking photographs of my elderly, unartistic parents. Do you know, for the first time in my life with my parents, I had really authentic conversations. So we talked about the speed of change, aging, because they were approaching into their 60s and 70s, and about death and mortality, and like really deep, serious conversations while I was making these portraits. And I think that set me up at the beginning to realise that the more I photographed people, I could actually have genuine, deep conversations with people and get to understand them better, and in the process understand myself better. I got a job working for Rowntree Mackintosh in York. Rowntree Mackintosh at that stage were probably the second biggest chocolate and confectionery manufacturers in the world. Fantastic place to work with lovely smells of roasting coffee and chocolate and fruit pulp and all those kind of delicious things. I moved to York, and for 9 months I lived in a really grotty flat. And the girlfriend that I'd been seeing, that I travelled on the Interrail trips with, we decided to get married, as you did back then. You didn't live together, but we were going to get married. So that's what we did at the tender ages of 21 and 20. And within 9 months, we were able to save enough money to buy a house. So we bought a house just on the north side of York. And then I began doing DIY, which I soon discovered I hated, and spent a couple of years doing up the house. But do you know, what was interesting was, I was triumphant. There I was, I'd been through all this momentous stuff. I'd gained an HND with a distinction. You know, I was married, I'd got a really good job. I was on the prestigious graduate scheme at Rowntree's. I'd got my own property. So I was triumphant, but that fell away fairly quickly over the next couple of years. And it's complex reasons why that happened, I think. The job didn't live up to expectations. So instead of being on the factory floor helping make confectionery, I was stuck in an office behind a computer screen, often on my own. So I got to feel quite isolated and at times lonely in such a huge factory. I started to question myself 2 or 3 years into the marriage that, crikey, you know, I'm still pretty young. Was I right to get married so young and settle down with the person right from the beginning of my career? But one of the main anxiety-inducing aspects that were going on at the time was Margaret Thatcher came into power in 1979 with a radical conservative government, and her policies were causing a deep, deep recession in the early 1980s. And in York in particular, a number of manufacturing companies were closing: Redford National Glass, Armstrong Brakes, Vickers Instruments, to name but 3. Even things at Rowntree's weren't looking good, and my job started to look insecure, and I felt insecure, and that perhaps my career wouldn't last very long there. So it wasn't a good time. And what I found myself going through was a loss of confidence, and that perhaps I hadn't made the right path after all. And within that loss of confidence, I started to not get anxious, but get the blues, be down. And a typical example would be on a Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, you know, during the winter, as the lights started to go down, I would feel pretty low. I wouldn't want to go back to work. And that kind of feelings disturbed me. And why should I be like that when I should still be triumphant and feel lucky and grateful? So amongst all that, I think you could say that photography came to the rescue. I look back at the time when I'd first bought that Rolleiflex and taken photographs of my parents and got into those engaging conversations, and I thought, well, maybe with the new people I'm meeting at work, my colleagues and other family members who we were still in touch with, that I could start to use the camera to connect with people again, maybe build a bit of confidence in myself and my ability to talk and engage with people. And the more I engage with these people, the more I could reference my own position in life, realise I had a lot to be grateful for, and that other people got down and had the blues as well. And those connections really came to the rescue. And in the process, of course, I ended up building a portfolio of what I was starting to feel were really good, engaging, intimate portraits that went below the surface of the person. So in the middle of this period of having the blues, my wife and I bought an old-fashioned bungalow in a village called Strensall on the north side of York. I spent the summer of 1983 in the front garden digging out a tree stump and doing various things there. And every evening, this was after work of course, every evening an old gentleman in a flat cap used to walk by, and he used to raise his stick in the air and say, "Good evening, sir." and I used to say, "Good evening," and then he'd walk away. Well, after this had happened 2 or 3 times, I thought, well, I'll engage with the guy and we'll have a short conversation and I'll discover who he is. And it turned out he was called Bill Simpson. He was going out for a walk with his dog called Widget Bum. And he had served in the trenches in the First World War and been severely injured in the leg, had a really bad leg. And he'd come out of the trauma of the trenches and got married himself, lived with his wife. He'd worked at Vickers Instruments that I mentioned, and had a really successful career. But now, sadly, his wife had died. He was elderly. He lived on his own just up the road. And the only thing he had really was the dog for company, and his stamp collection and his love of roses back home. So anyway, just as he went to walk away, I kind of glanced around the side of the hedge. I stood this side of the hedge, and I noticed that as he walked, he stuck his left leg out really stiffly from the injury he'd had in the trenches. But the dog, who had been run over apparently, had got a broken leg at the back, which was really stiff, and the dog stuck its right leg off. So they were kind of limping in unison as they went down the street, which I thought was quite funny. Anyway, he was so kind. He invited me around to his house for tea one afternoon, and I took my camera and I just said, "Can I make some pictures of you?" And he was only too happy to be involved, and I managed to get a lovely shot of him with his dog Widget Bum shaking its head madly as it used to do. Another person that I photographed during that time, around about 1985, was a young lad called John Lally. He'd been brought up by adopted parents in Sands End near Whitby and went to Scarborough Art College, being interested in art, and that led to him going down to Bournemouth, and he did a diploma in photography, came back to York wanting to set up a film processing unit himself, but it didn't work out. His interest in photography faded a little bit over the following year, and he ended up really championing green causes, which were an emerging issue then. So he joined Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, became a vegetarian, and had his own allotment, and then he adopted a malodorous Dalmatian dog that suffered from flatulence that he called Dylan, and he built a wooden cart for this dog and used to tow it on his bicycle around York. And he also set up an environmental organisation called Divine Wind, which we thought had been inspired actually by the flatulent Dalmatian. But I'm saying all these things in amusement. John actually was a deep and thoughtful person, and actually drove environmental issues in York and support for them a great deal. So he was a very successful campaigner and a lovely man in the process. And we became very close friends. And so one day he invited me round to his bedsit, this damp single room bedsit in Melbourne Street on the south side of York, and I photographed him there in that bedsit, and I sensed at the time something deeper in his character, and very, very sadly about 10 years later he took his own life. So that was a big shock to myself and all the friends that knew him, and it affected us quite badly for a time. So I've dedicated this book of portraits to John in his memory and for all the good things that he did with his life. And I have to say it was a privilege to know him. So while John was alive, it came round in June to his birthday, and a woman who I didn't know called Hatti Rogers, who lived in a street in York, a Terrace House Street, invited us all round to a surprise birthday party for John. She hosted it, and it was a great party. I really enjoyed it. I went along, and I got talking to this woman who was hosting the party, and she was something very unusual from the women I was used to talking, certainly meeting at work. She was a bit of a hippie. Unusually at that time, she had a nose stud, she had a tattoo on her leg, she smoked rolly cigarettes, and she was a very strong personality, really interesting to listen to and talk to, but unusually for women and men of that age, a really good listener. So she was engaging in things that I was talking about and portraits that I was making at the time. She was really good at listening to. By sheer serendipity, about 2 or 3 nights later, I was in my favourite pub of the time, the John Bull. 1950s style pub, drinking a pint of Timothy Taylor's Landlord Bitter, and in walked Hatti from the back room. And I said, "Oh, hello, I was talking to you at the party." And she said, "Oh, yes, you would." And after we talked for a little while, I had this idea, wow, she would make a great person to photograph. So I asked her, and she at first said, "Oh, yeah, okay." Now, apparently she tells me later that she thought about it, thought, "No, I don't want this guy to photograph me." Thankfully, she let me go ahead. So I went round to a house where the party had been, and I photographed her in the back room. I took the contact sheets round that I made in the dark room, and she really liked them. Then I took the prints that she'd picked round. She really liked the prints, and I took the prints round, I think, on my motorbike. And while I was there, she said, "Well, can I have a ride on the back of your motorbike?" And I thought, wow, not only has this woman got all these qualities, but she likes motorbikes and riding them on them as well. And so we became friends, and subsequently, as you know, she became my second wife. By the end of the 1980s, I ended up with perhaps about 70 to 80 portraits of various people I'd met, family, extended family, colleagues and friends, and I printed them into what I thought were a really nice set of prints. But do you know, I put them in a box and I did very little with them after that. I moved on, my life moved on, and I started photographing other things and other projects. Recently, in the last 10 years, since things have gone digital, I bought a scanner, so I scanned all those negatives, and as I got to understand software like Lightroom and Photoshop and Capture One, I produced digital prints, which I have to say I actually prefer now to the darkroom prints. There I had all these prints, and I thought I really need to do something more with them. By that time, I really had in mind I would produce a book of portraits, but I wanted to make it something more special in terms of the quality, the feel of the book, the texture of the book, and to add a lot of writing about the experiences I'd had, the low mood that I'd suffered at the beginning, and how the connections with people had helped lift that. So I edited the many portraits down to 43 in the end. Strange number, but I felt 43 of the best and most significant portraits, and I spent quite a long time writing pieces of prose to sit opposite those images, not interfere with them, but actually describe the experience behind that portrait session and the person that I'd photographed. The whole thing about that project was it helped me identify who I was, to realise my own position and be grateful for that, and to re-establish my self-confidence. So those connections with people, it actually dispelled the blues. So the title came very naturally as The Blues Connections Dispel. I was down at the funeral of my friend John Curnow, the landscape photographer, and I was staying in a pub in a village where he'd lived called Drew Stainton is the name of the village, and I think it's the Drew Stainton Arms was the pub that I was staying in. And I was talking to the landlord over breakfast. I mentioned I was down here for the funeral of John Curnow, did he know him? And he had heard of him, and he said, "Oh, hang on just a minute." And he reached to a bookshelf in the snug in this pub and pulled out one of John's books, and he was familiar with the images. And it really reinforced to me the fact that, well, take John as an example, he produced 10 books in his lifetime. And so although he's got prints, and he's got prints that he's sold to national institutions, so he could genuinely claim he had his work in national collections, the big thing that he really did as a legacy for all the work he put into his photography was these 10 books that are out there. It reinforced to me that I have all these hundreds, thousands of negatives and prints that are sitting in a cupboard, and I don't want it just end up in a plastic bin liner. I want to get it out there and to share it. So hopefully this book, The Blues Connections Dispel, works in the way I want it to. It's the beginning of me moving onto a phase where I'm going to focus on outputting books, hopefully one every year, every 18 months. And so going forward, my main focus, my main ambition now from a legacy perspective is to publish books for as long as I can, till I drop. Looking back at the time I've spent in photographing people, and for anybody starting out, on that journey. What I would say right from the beginning, things that I've worked out along the way, is understand why you want to photograph somebody. What's the genuine reason? Be genuine. I like to think of it that I'm curious about that person. And I genuinely want to understand more about them. I would say don't be in a rush. Be obvious that you are a photographer, but start off maybe by having a conversation and inquiring about them. And if you ask genuine questions about them, about their history, about where they work and things like that, they're only more than happy to tell you about that. And it puts them at their ease, and then when the time comes you can lift the camera and you can begin photographing them in an open, honest way.
I really hope you found that as helpful and inspiring as I did. And I just want to say that Paul is actually the person you see on camera. In fact, he came across to our retreat in Italy this year, and we went for a walk to one of the local villages. And as we walked into the village, there were a few old ladies sitting in the town square, and Paul made his way straight over to them and began chatting to them immediately. He didn't even speak the language, but he has such a kind demeanor and a genuine interest in people that these ladies fell in love with him straight away and were happy to have their portraits taken. Watching Paul work and interact with people has taught me a great deal about what it actually means to be a portrait photographer. I hope too that his story has got you thinking about the connections we make in our lives and how the camera can actually be a useful tool to get us out of the house and to reconnect us with the people around us, especially if we're feeling isolated or disillusioned and a bit rudderless. For all of us, when we reach that stage, the answer is to get out there and plug back in with people. And I know how difficult that is sometimes. We sometimes struggle to find the courage and the motivation to actually get out the front door. I think that's when picking up the camera can be a great excuse to get us off the couch and back into people's lives, to actually reconnect and talk and to plug back in, because in those conversations we'll get more perspective about where we're at and context for our own lives. If it worked for Paul, I promise you it will work for you too. If you're interested in Paul's latest book or any of his other work or the other books that he's already released, I'm going to leave a link to his website down in the description, and I'm also going to leave an email where you can contact Paul directly and let him know that you'd like to pick up a copy when the book is available. And then just before I go, I want to remind you about my Parable magazine. There are still copies available of all 4 editions. Each magazine is writing and photography about a theme. I usually start out talking about photography specifically there, but then end with something a lot more inspirational that hopefully is deep and meaningful to your own lives. So I'm going to leave a link down below if you want to go check those magazines out. They are available as physical copies like you've seen here, or you can download the PDF with the MP3 audio of me reading the magazine to you. And then lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. One of the really useful aspects about Squarespace is actually selling things like my magazines or prints online. I always found that quite intimidating. How was I going to take money from people and get addresses for orders? But setting up a store on Squarespace, loading up photographs and prices and product descriptions took no time at all. And then I can see the money coming in, I can track sales, I can see the email addresses and the contact details and the physical postal addresses that come in. And I can even have an automated system where customers, once the item has been shipped, they get an email notifying them that their product is on the way. It couldn't be simpler.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.